So I want to just start with a portrait of Paul's life, because I think it's important for us to understand the church's role and what we should be doing, and even the historical role of the church. So let me just read this to you from Galatians chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. I'm going to use the Message translation as I sort of give you a picture of what's going on in the church. Listen to what Paul says. He says, "My dear friends, what I would really like you to do is to try to put yourselves in my shoes to the same extent that I, when I was with you, put myself in yours." Pay attention to that. "You were very sensitive and kind then. You did not come down on me personally. You were well aware that the reason I ended up preaching to you was that I was physically broken, and so prevented me from continuing my journey. I was forced to stop with you. That is how I came to preach with you. And don't you remember that even though taking in a sick guest was most troublesome for you, you chose to treat me as well as you would have treated an angel of God, as well as you would have treated Jesus himself if he had visited you. What has happened to the satisfaction you felt at that time? There were some of you then who, if possible, watch this, would have given your very eyes to me. That is how deeply you cared. And now have I suddenly become your enemy simply by telling you the truth? I can't believe it." Here's something that maybe, as you have studied, maybe you studied the book of Galatians, and maybe you haven't, but maybe you haven't come across this and really understood the depths of what Paul is talking about. So Galatians is a letter that is one of Paul's earliest. As a matter of fact, it's his first. And so what's important to understand about the context is that these thoughts in Galatians are Paul's most unfiltered response to his experience with the church. Because you remember, Paul was converted on that Damascus road. He was actually the one who was persecuting the church. And so these words in Galatians are the closest to his conversion to Christianity. So what you get, sometimes I think Paul is a little bit like me, that he don't have very much of a filter. He just says what he thinks. And if you read Galatians, you'll kind of catch that spirit where he's talking about, I don't care nothing about these apostles and they weren't better than me. Like Paul, if you read Galatians, this is his most unfiltered experience with the church, which means that these are probably the most honest of his experiences with the church. And you notice that he says, when I came to the province of Galatia, it wasn't because I wanted to stop there. Watch this. He says that my body was physically broken. Did you catch that? In other words, he says, my body made a choice for me that I didn't choose. And oftentimes that's the life of living with some form of a disability, whether it's intellectual, developmental, or physical. Your body makes choices for you that you yourself are not choosing. But Paul says, this is how I came to preach the gospel to you. In other words, even though it was because I had what he calls a physical brokenness, you later hear him say that some of you were so kind that you would have even given me your eyes, which lends us to believe that one of the things that Paul was struggling with as far as a disability is that he was going blind, which gives context to now his thorn in Corinthians, which some scholars also believe that he may have some form of epilepsy that may or may not have been a result of his Damascus Road experience. Remember, it knocked him down off of his horse, and he was blinded for many days. And we also know that Paul, what they describe, used to have some trances. You remember, he says, I was caught up in the third heaven. And so some scholars believe, and I tend to agree, that he was going blind. He may have also had some form of epilepsy. But in Galatians, his most unfiltered experience with the church, he says, I wasn't even planning to stop here, but because of my disability, it made me stop here, and I began to preach the gospel to you. And in the beginning, you were kind to me. Did you catch what he says? He says that even though I was sick and I had issues, you took me in and you treated me as though I was an angel from God or Jesus himself. You didn't consider me a burden. But something happened. He says that my earliest experience with the church was that you treated me well. You opened your arms to me despite the fact that you had to accommodate me. You had to do things for me that you didn't have to do for other people. And you welcomed me and you did it with joy. And some of you loved me so much that if you could have given me your eyes, you would have done that. And then he goes on to say, what has happened to the satisfaction you felt at that time? There were some of you who, if possible, you would have given me your eyes. That's how deeply you cared. And now have I suddenly become your enemy simply because I'm telling you the truth? Paul's most unfiltered experience with the church was that the church began its mission by caring for those who had physical limitations. And they were happy to do that. And then Paul says, but something changed. Can I tell you, I think that's still the trajectory of the church. As Paul's apparently in Galatians describing what he describes as a difficult time with the church. He mentions his own physical limitations, which the church initially accommodated, but something happened. And what Paul began to discern was a distance developing between him and the church. I think that's still true because the early church, I'll show you, began with not what they call disability or special needs ministry. It was just their response to being obedient to the teachings of Jesus, and something happened. Paul says something happened. I remember as a kid growing up, and even though I wasn't diagnosed until I was 36, around 7 or 8, I knew that there were differences between me and other kids. Like there was just things I didn't understand. I didn't get. I stuck out like a sore thumb. I was bullied. There were all sorts of things. Most of it socially, anxiety, not understanding body language and social cues. And you can understand that if 90% of communication is nonverbal and I don't get that, that's hard to deal with people. And I remember as a young boy growing up in the Baptist church, and there was a time to take communion, and they were passing the communion. That's back when we used to pass the communion around. You had the ushers. Remember the white gloves and the ushers, they used to pass it. And I remember reaching out my hand to take some of the communion, and this is not a commentary on a theology of the Eucharist. All I remember was a white cold glove. I don't know how it was cold and you had gloves on, but a white cold hand grabbed my hand and snatched it back from the communion, probably because I hadn't been baptized. I get that now, but here's my point. People always remember how you make them feel. And all that did for me at the age of 7, 8, or 9, whenever that was, I can't remember the age, is it only confirmed to me that my difference was so distinct that even God didn't want to have anything to do with me. And Paul says, we started off doing well, and then all of a sudden something happened.